Welcome, everyone, to today's Endowment for Middle East Truth webinar featuring historian, journalist, and author Gil Troy discussing the state of Israel's democracy. Today's webinar has been sponsored by Ron Ziegel, who I would like to thank on behalf of everyone here at EMET for his generosity and support. I'm told that Ron was moved by some of our previous webinars, and as I've shared, our work is only possible with the support of you all. So I hope that those of you who tune in weekly and find our webinars featuring the world's leading experts on national security and related topics informative, also consider sponsoring a future webinar through a contribution to our organization. It is your assistance that allows us to continue our important work on the Hill to fight the battle to ensure a safe and secure Israel and Middle East and strong U.S. national security. Today's webinar will be recorded for future viewing, and I encourage everyone to share the link once it's been sent out. If you have any questions for our speaker, please feel free to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens to submit a question, and I'll try and get to as many as possible a bit later in the program. Please only submit questions. A distinguished scholar in North American history at McGill University, currently living in Jerusalem, Gil Troy is an award-winning American presidential historian and a leading Zionist activist. He is most recently the editor of the new three-volume set, Theodor Herzl, Zionist Writings, the inaugural publication of the Library of the Jewish People. 2 years ago, he co-authored with Natan Sharansky, Never Alone, Prison Politics and My People. Recently designated one of Allgemeiner's J100, one of the top 100 people positively influencing Jewish life, Gil Troy is the author of The Zionist Ideas, an update and expansion of Arthur Hertzberg's classic anthology, The Zionist Idea. He currently writes a weekly column for the Jerusalem Post, and I urge you all to follow his work. Welcome, Gil, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Great to be with you. And I'm a big fan of the important work that you guys do at EMET.
Thank you. Thanks, Gil. Before we get into the specifics of the internal political discussions and conflicts pertaining to the proposed judicial reforms, they're at the core of the domestic divisions in Israel, and we will focus on those. I did want to discuss or, take a look at the big picture. As week after week, it seems more and more people are taking to the streets to protest the government and its proposals. From the perspective of an American Jew who supports Israel unconditionally, the constant drumbeat of protests, hyperbole from public officials, and threats of the demise of democracy is becoming quite troubling. In a column that you wrote in Tablet magazine in early February entitled Israeli Democracy is Fine, Thank You for Asking, and we're going to put the link to that in the chat, and I urge everybody to read it. You made the point that while the U.S. can withstand two warring political parties, Israel cannot. Unlike the U.S., Israel exists in a neighborhood surrounded by enemies and is treated as a pariah on the international stage. But you conclude that Israel's democratic culture is resilient while America's is a polarized partisan mess, and stated, Israelis beware, no country should use America today as a model for how to debate constructively and democratically. America is a democracy in crisis. You further recognize that, quote, no democracy is problem-free, and it is self-defeating to hear every governmental initiative you dislike as liberty's death knell. While there is much to debate about Israel's judicial system, reports of the death of Israeli democracy are highly exaggerated. That was 2 weeks ago, and since that time, tens of thousands have taken to the streets to protest on a weekly basis, led by former Prime Minister Yair Lapid and other opposition leaders. Netanyahu's life has been threatened, and the international community, including the American Jewish community, is focusing on policies of the Netanyahu-led government that they believe to truly end Israeli democracy as we know it. Can you elaborate on this and whether, after several more weeks of massive protests and hyperbolic rhetoric from Israeli opposition leaders, whether you stand by that position? Is Israel's democracy fine?
Before I get to that question, I just want to say that that sentence that you quoted about America being a democracy in crisis and it not being a model was really a sentence that was very painful for me to write and very hard for me to write, because I, as an American historian, and as part of this extraordinary miracle called the United States of America and called American Jewry, even though I've been living in Israel for the last 15 years, have always appreciated America as the model democracy and a model for Israel to follow in some ways, but not other ways. And so hearing those words read back to me was kind of painful yet again. And I take no joy in the crisis that's going on in the United States of America, but I certainly want to warn my fellow Israelis and my fellow American Jews, beware, don't use the model that was used to fight Donald Trump as a model to fight within Israel. Now, before I get to the essence of my analysis on democracy, I just want to say that I came back. I'm speaking to you from Jerusalem, from my home. It's in the evening. And this morning, I was at the Our Crowd Summit. And there are 6,500 people in that summit from all over the world, mostly from Israel, but from the United States, from the UAE, coming. And the energy in Binyan Homa, the convention center, the creativity, the commitment to the future shows Am Yisrael Chai, the Jewish people live, Israel is doing fine. And while we certainly have our political issues, all these chicken little sky is falling, doom and gloomers from the left and from the right are just wrong. I'm a historian. I always say it's hard enough to predict the past. I'm not going to predict the future. But when I do a deep dive, as I tried to do in the article, into what's really going on with Israeli democracy, and when I just walk the streets of Jerusalem, jog every day, go out to places like Binyan Homa and see the idealism, see the creativity, see the economic growth, hear someone like Saul Singer, who wrote Startup Nation, saying, too many democracies today are old and fraying and decaying. Israel is young and growing and thriving. I say, let's not start saying Kaddish, mourning the death of Israeli democracy just yet. And part of the way I approached this was I was looking for solutions with my American history mortarboard on as a professor, looking at the analysis that other people have used to assess what's going on in American democracy and seeing are there any interesting thoughts, any interesting ideas that have been used to sort of improve American democracy, and maybe some of them could be imported to Israel. And I come across the work of Parker Palmer, who is an educational anthropologist and sociologist. And he, quoting one of every American historian's favorite writers, Alexis de Tocqueville, talks about the habits of the heart. Alexis de Tocqueville is a French aristocrat who comes to the United States of America in the 1800s. It's an America that has many corrupt elections. I'm sorry to say, way more corrupt than our elections today. It's an America that's fighting the Indians, that's enslaving African Americans, that has Andrew Jackson, who's not the paragon of virtue necessarily at the head of state. But the democracy that Tocqueville sees is what he calls from the habits of the heart. And I translate that today into the songs of the street. And Parker Palmer, who wrote his analysis in 2011, before Trump, when Barack Obama was president, saying, wait a minute, we've got a crisis here. And he goes through tick, 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 the habits of the heart that he wants to build for America. Have a sense of common destiny. Care about one another. Talk to one another. Have a sense of community, of tradition, of identity. And I'm reading this and going, oh my goodness, that's what's going on in Israel every single day when Netanyahu is in power and when Lapid and Bennett are in power, when we are governed by the left and governed by the right. And that's why this language of crisis, this sky is falling language, is just not appropriate for the moment.
I'm so happy to hear you say that again, because as an American Jew who unfortunately has not been able to visit Israel since COVID, it's hard to keep your perspective. So I'm happy to hear you say that. So again, we're going to get into the details of the judicial reforms, but I also want to ask you, on the heels of Herzog's speech on Sunday, how do you reconcile the continued animosity and refusal to negotiate without preconditions on the part of the opposition in response to that speech? The Netanyahu government indicated after Herzog's speech that a willingness to negotiate, despite saying that they wouldn't halt the process. They did agree to wait a week to bring votes to the plenum. However, Lapid and others said that they refuse to talk unless the process is halted, and stated, until then, the fight won't stop, the protest won't stop, with opposition leaders threatening to continue to take action until the government, quote, announces it is entirely removing the threat of destroying Zionism and democracy. Putting aside the melodramatic rhetoric, I hate to make an analogy in poor taste, but it reminds me of the PA refusing to negotiate until their demands are met, thus holding Israel hostage, except that currently it's the opposition that seems to be holding Israel hostage. I'll add that Herzog stated that the proposed reform raises a deep concern of their potential for harm for the state of Israel's democratic institutions. So again, he's using that same rhetoric. And he added, the power keg is about to explode and brother is about to raise his hand against brother, implying a catastrophe of biblical proportions. How do you respond to that?
I'm what I like to call a muscular moderate. I'm a man of the center, but I don't like to be a kind of marshmallow moderate who says, oh, you're you're right, you're right, you're right too. A muscular moderate, like our president of the state of Israel right now, Isaac Herzog, really believes in core principles and really believes in centrism as a way of trying to find what we need in democracy, which is a common path. And it's not just Herzog and it's not just Troy, but 64% of Israelis polled have asked for compromise, have asked for some kind of constructive process. And sometimes as a moderate, it's kind of unpleasant because you get attacked from the right and you attacked from the left. But sometimes it's actually quite fun to be a moderate because you can look to the right and you can look at the government and say, wait a minute, slow down. Make a distinction between the kind of policy changes that I call government by speedboat, where yes, as you go from Democrats to Republicans, as you go from a Bibi-led government to a Bennett-Lapid government back to a Bibi-led government, you're going to make policy changes that are going to be quite abrupt. And make a distinction between those kind of speedboat changes and ship of state kind of changes, constitutive changes. And one of the things that President Herzog called for in his most welcome speech was a kind of basic law about legislation that would say, let's distinguish between the rules of the game and between basic rights, and those things have to be on like a different timetable, and policies, taxes, responses. So I'm disturbed by what's going on the right because there is a rush and there's an impatience and there's an insensitivity to the 64% who are saying slow down. At the same time, when President Herzog and certain voices on the right say, wait a minute, we're willing to compromise, we're willing to at least talk about it, to have Yair Lapid, whom I supported when he was running a government where he said it's a 70-30 government, Bennett and I disagree about 30%, but we agree on 70%. We're centrists, we're constructive. To hear him and to hear Ehud Barak and to hear others use such extreme language and to refuse to negotiate was to me truly shocking. And I think that both sides need to say, wait a minute, we've just gotten the fig leaf. The president of the state of Israel gave us a way down. It gave us a way to de-escalate. We're causing way too much stress in the Israeli home. We're causing way too much stress on the Israeli street. And frankly, as I did say in the article, and as you quoted kindly, we are telegraphing to the United States of America and to the Western democracies a democratic crisis which doesn't exist as intensely as it seems. And we're also, even worse, telegraphing to our Palestinian and Iranian enemies, and I use that word, a weakness that doesn't exist. And so who benefits from all this chaos? I certainly don't as a citizen. My kids certainly don't, those who are serving in the army and those who have served, and our families don't.
So I think, so now's a good time to spend a few minutes just discussing the proposed judicial reforms. And then we can continue along the lines that we were, because I do want to get into some of the things that Lapid and others have said. But can you share with our audience the way the Israeli judicial system works, and in particular, the powers of the Israeli Supreme Court versus the proposals that would bring the judiciary more in line with the way the U.S. checks and balances work? I mean, in fact, don't the proposed reforms limit the power of unelected judges to overrule legislation implemented by elected representatives and give those representatives more power over the selection of judges, reducing the power of the unelected members of the Supreme Court to choose their successors, while also requiring the courts to follow the law as opposed to imposing their personal opinions on legal standards such as reasonableness? And if that's in fact the case, and these reforms bring Israel's judiciary more in line with Western nations, how is this undemocratic, fascist, authoritarian, and why aren't the facts getting out to the public both in Israel and the US?
At the risk of replicating Ronald Reagan's mistake, Jane Wyman, his first wife, used to say, you'd ask Ronald Reagan what time it is and he'd tell you the history of the Swiss clocks. I think as a historian, I always say my favorite text is context. So we do have to take the camera and roll it back a little bit. Permit me to just focus on two moments in history before we get to this moment in history. One, it's 1949. The 1948 Declaration of Independence, when Israel was established, called for a constitutional convention. The myth tells us that, oh, those religious fanatics who didn't want a constitution because they said we have the Torah blocked it. The truth, because I did that silly little historical thing called research, is that David Ben-Gurion himself did not want a constitution, and for various reasons. One of the reasons was he didn't want any constraints on his power. Second, he has this delightful phrase. He says, why should we pass a decision now that's going to stop us 300 years from now? And I love the fact that he's thinking 300 years in the future. But he also points out, he says, the British don't have a constitution. They simply have a set of understandings. But most important of all, he said, and it's very relevant for today, he said, we have emergencies. We have to absorb immigrants from all over the world. We have to establish a state. We have to fight off the 6 Arab armies that have attacked. If we start a constitutional debate, we're Jews. We're gonna yell and scream about theory for the next 2 and 3, 4 years. We've got to build our state. And that's why there was no constitution. Under David Ben-Gurion and the labor regime, which dominated until 1977, the courts were extremely weak. And then in the early 1990s, when government's going back and forth between left and right, there is a series of basic laws that are passed. And Aharon Barak, a very talented, very smart, very patriotic, and very Zionist Supreme Court justice, decides it's time for us to model a little bit more on the American model. We need judicial review. We need to use these basic laws. We need to use these protections of rights that are being offered by the Knesset to indeed say certain things in a democracy, because democracy isn't a pure democracy. We're not the Greeks sitting around or the New England townsmen sitting around and passing everything through voice vote. We need to have majority rule and minority rights. And so Aharon Barak, in a very clever, but frankly, not very populist or lowercase d democratic way, institutes this judicial revolution. And it grows and grows. And you take an Israeli court, which in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s was way weaker than the American Supreme Court. All of a sudden, by the 1990s and ever since, its power grows and grows. And how does it grow and grow? One is that you have these questions of standing. In the United States of America today, for me to take a case to the Supreme Court, or to actually any court, I need standing. In Israel, there isn't the same kind of requirement. And so there's a much looser base where I can just say, I don't like something that's happening. And even if I'm not materially affected, I can bring it to the court. There's this, what you mentioned, the reasonableness rule, which is saying that, well, even if it's not technically written in the Constitution, which doesn't exist, or the basic laws, or in any kind of law passed the Knesset, if it doesn't pass a smell test, if it seems unreasonable, then we as judges can invalidate a law. And whereas the Israeli Supreme Court has invalidated very, very few laws, it has invalidated many administrative decisions. And so over the years, very thoughtful people said, whoa, if traditionally the court was too weak, now the court is getting too strong. Now here, by the way, is the huge victory that the right has achieved within 2 months. So many of my friends on the left, not the far left, but certainly the center left, and many of us in the center, start our conversation by saying, of course, there are abuses in the way the court is operating these days. Of course, for too long, the way judges were elected was too insular and too much of an insider boys and girls club. Of course, we need to make changes. And that was actually the essence of President Herzog's speech. But the fact that that sentence, of course, is now kind of part and parcel of the debate shows how effective the right has been in passing into the bloodstream of the nation this sense of, well, there's a problem with the court. And I, frankly, want the right to take the victory and say, okay, we've gotten the message. We do need to make some changes, but the more fundamental a change is in a society, the slower it has to be, and the more you have to do consensus building. And so I agree with the right that it was too much of a kind of insiders club, although, by the way, you have to point out that even 5, 6, 7 years ago, there were certain changes. It used to be that basically the sitting judges and the Bar Association appointed judges. Recently, politicians have had input. And so it's a bit of a lie from the far right that there has never been any change and that there isn't any kind of voice of politics. But the far left now is trying to say any change is going to destroy Israeli democracy. And so the debate has gotten way too extreme. And again, the 64% of Israelis are saying, okay, we accept that we need to have some kind of change, but we need to slow that change down. Most specifically, what are the most contentious points? How are judges picked? How much power does the court have to invalidate legislation? Is there some legislation that should be holier than other legislation? Do you need a unanimous court? Do you need the entire Supreme Court sitting? So that's a whole other dimension, this question of reasonableness. And another thing that's often overlooked is that part of the judicial revolution was saying that if an advisor to a cabinet minister says, don't do this, in the United States, that's often advisory. And if the cabinet minister disobeys the law and it's actually, and it's actual criminal act, they can be held accountable. But the legal advisor doesn't control the acts of the cabinet minister. In Israel, as part of this revolution, the decisions that are made by the legal advisor can often be binding in a very powerful way on the cabinet minister. And so the feeling was, where's the voice of the people? Now, again, we know that none of these systems, not the British system, not the Canadian system, even the Holy Canadian system, not the American system, is perfect. So Israel definitely needs a rebalance. The question is, how do you do it? Who does it? And how do you build a consensus around it so that rather than having these screeches from the left and the right about the democracy isn't working at all, and there's no voice from the people, which isn't true, or there isn't going to be any democracy left from the left, the cry to the left. How do you find some kind of thoughtful, mature process? And I think that's what President Herzog was calling for on Sunday.
Yeah, and there's actually a good Alan Dershowitz piece that came out yesterday in which he proposes some compromises that he suggests some compromises for the parties. But my question is that even possible with Bibi's coalition? I mean, if Bibi decides to slow things down, and your last week's J-Post column also, you're referring to some of the things that you said, slow things down. Is that possible, or will Bibi's coalition fall apart? Will some of his far right, members threaten, if you compromise, if you slow it down, we're out, we're done, we'll break apart this government, we'll have to start over again?
Look, it's hard to know. Some people from within the government say that if you actually look at the way the legislation was written, it was written in the most extreme way because there's this thing called negotiation. And you start with your most extreme position because you're willing to make certain concessions. So some people fear that. So some people say that that's the strategy. There's a broader strategy involved. Micha Goodman, the philosopher and analyst, wrote a very interesting piece speculating. He said, this is a very interesting crossroads. This could lead to real constitutional breakdown and social tension, as everybody, especially in the United States, is predicting. Or, he said, in the same way that when there was all this talk about annexation, Bibi Netanyahu pulled out of his hat the Abraham Accords, maybe Netanyahu's been relatively quiet for Bibi in this whole debate. Maybe he's waiting for there to be an impasse, and he's going to pull out some kind of constitutional process. And maybe because he does indeed only have a coalition of 64, and he's worried about people walking out, that he has to be more cautious. I don't know. I'm a historian, so I focus on what happened rather than what will happen. But there are various theories out there. The most important thing to emphasize is that nothing has happened yet. Yelling and screaming that democracy is dying is an act of democratic freedom. And so what we've seen in the last 2 months has been the robustness of Israeli democracy. We've seen even this week where you started having the first readings in a parliamentary system. There are all kinds of ideas which pass first readings that then never get much further. So we just don't know what's going on the inside. We don't know what's happening between the more mature voices in the room. And frankly, we don't know, there's a whole issue. You're right. You mentioned coalition members, such as the people from the religious Zionist party who might bolt. We don't know what's going on with Likud. We keep on hearing some murmurings of Likud members who feel like they didn't get proper cabinet positions. We keep on hearing murmurings of some Likud members who are quite secular who don't want the ultra-Orthodox running. There was an excellent column by Ben-Dror Yemini, who's a very thoughtful observer, and he said two things. One, he said what I said earlier, which is, listen to the majority. The majority wants balance, wants some change, but thoughtful, mature, constitutive change. But the second half of his column was, he says, people like Simcha Rothman, who is the Knesset member, the chair of the committee that's pushing this through, and who's very committed to judicial reform. He's not a fool. He knows that the day Israel is seen to not have a robust judiciary is the day that every soldier who's going off to India after serving or to visit his or her grandparents in the States could potentially be arrested if the International Criminal Court doesn't see a robust judiciary. Rothman doesn't want to see that happen. He also knows that if the society and the polity is seen as being held hostage by extreme voices within the society, the people who serve in the army, the people who pay taxes won't be happy. And so we just don't know how much of what's going on is kind of a, not Japanese kabuki drama, but an Israeli kabuki drama? And how much of it is a genuine crisis where things are rupturing?
That's good, because that leads into my next question. And I keep coming back to the fact that much of the inflammatory rhetoric that's coming from the upper echelon members of the Israeli government and military is purely political in nature. One of the best examples of this is a Yair Lapid statement that Carolyn Glick included in one of her recent columns and drew to my attention. Lapid is now leading the opposition, and I'm going to be kind calling it the opposition, because it's actually more like a civilian-led coup, as he likes to call the Netanyahu government. But he once stated, and this is important, quote, "I have opposed, and I still oppose, judicial activism of the sort introduced by former Supreme Court President and the father of Israel's judicial revolution, Justice Aaron Barak. I don't think it is right that everything is justiciable. I don't think it is right for the Supreme Court to change fundamental things in accordance with what it refers to as the judgment of the, quote, reasonable person. That's an amorphous and completely subjective definition that the Knesset never introduced to the legal code. It's not right in my mind that the separation of powers, the sacrosanct foundation of the democratic method, should be breached by one branch of government placing itself above the others." So, Gil, what exactly is going on? We've got a former defense minister and IDF chief of general staff, Moshe Ya'alon, calling the current government a dictatorship, criminal, illegal. Every Haaretz column uses the word coup, end of democracy, fascist, racist, homophobic, messianic, corrupt. I mean, there's calls for civil war, calls for Netanyahu's murder, strikes, destruction of the economy. We're going to talk about the economy shortly. It seems to me this is more a power struggle than it is a true concern about, the separation of powers and the demise of Israel's democracy. Is this mostly political gamemanship at the expense of Israel's stability?
Look, there are very serious substantive issues underlying it. And there is a valid critique of the government's haste and some of the government's rhetoric too. But again, if we're going to be a good historian and we're going to talk about our favorite text being context, let's pull back the camera just a little bit. Let's go back a year and a half ago when Naftali Bennett comes in as prime minister and Bibi Netanyahu doesn't even use the words prime minister in front of Naftali Bennett's name. There's a lovely Arab expression called sakin b'sakin, knife sharpens knife. It is heartbreaking to me that the year and a half that Netanyahu was in opposition, I felt he acted in a very unpatriotic way, that he acted in a very incendiary way. And it is equally heartbreaking to me that since Netanyahu has come to power, in fact, even in the months before Netanyahu was even able to form a coalition, the opposition has been equally reprehensible in its behavior. And so on the one hand, this is just gamesmanship and an ugly kind of politics. But what they're missing is that this kind of rhetoric, this kind of behavior is scarring. And what they're also missing, and this is again why I'm comfortable with my perch as a muscular moderate, is let's be meta for a second. Let's look at what's going on in the United States of America as well. The Democrats succeeded. They got Trump out of office. But just as some of Donald Trump's behavior was scarring and traumatic, so too some of the Democratic opposition's behavior was traumatic and scarring. I don't want the President of the United States, Joe Biden, talking about voting reform and saying anybody who disagrees with the way the votes operate is perpetuating Jim Crow. Jim Crow? What false analogizing? And so unfortunately, in the age of Twitterdom, and I spell Twitterdom not D-O-M, but D-O-M-B, in an age of social media, we have these demons unleashed, and these demons undermine democracy. Hope is a self-fulfilling prophecy, and so is despair. And so one of the things I'm calling for, both in the United States and in Israel, is for the opposition and for the powers that be to stop modeling their behavior on the last time those guys and gals had power, and to start really modeling a different kind of approach. And I can talk about Ronald Reagan and Barack Obama. Both of them, for all their flaws and for all their differences, both tried to often, not always, step up. Both tried and were aware of the fact that they weren't just president of the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, but they were president of the United States of America. I need prime ministers in Israel who lead Israel, not just those who voted for them. And I need opposition leaders who understand, as President Herzog did when he was in opposition, that, for example, when it came time to fight Iran, he didn't say, oh, if Bibi and Trump are against Iran, I have to be for Iran. He said, no, Iran is a threat to my people. Iran is a threat to the United States of America. Iran is a threat to the world order. And so despite being in opposition, I'm going to work with Bibi Netanyahu against the Iran deal. And lo and behold, that kind of cooperation meant that after his years in opposition, President Herzog was elected as president of the state of Israel by a Knesset which was overwhelmingly dominated by Bibi Netanyahu and the Likud. That kind of bipartisanship, it's not really bipartisanship in Israel because it's multipartisanship, but that kind of patriotism, I'm sorry to say, is in short supply in the United States and is now being threatened by the harsh rhetoric of the far left and the far right in Israel. And so my plea, left and right, in Israel and the United States, is calm it down. It's not helping. It's not working. You think it's working because you get 90,000 people out. And you're right. 90,000 people aren't going to come out for a muscular, moderate kumbaya love-a-thon. But what are you accomplishing? And what damage, what long-term damage will be lasting?
I mean, I want to stick to this subject for a minute, and I don't mean to beat a dead horse, but the comparison with the U.S. I think is quite powerful. And I said this to you when we were about to go live, that I always thought that Israelis had a survival instinct that American Jews lacked. And I'm starting to question the Israeli left's survival instincts as we watch what's going on with the Israeli left seemingly emulating the anti-Trump resistance movement, and the Israeli media mirroring the left-wing bias of the US media. Are Israeli citizens being brainwashed like the American left, I believe, was during the 4 years that established a Trump derangement syndrome that'll be written into the history books forever? I mean, after all, it's one thing to oppose a political party, as you've discussed, but quite another to call for violent resistance. And you've got Ehud Barak comparing Herzog's position on judicial reform to Chamberlain's appeasement of the Nazis. You've got protesters comparing Bibi to Mussolini. Omer, a convicted former prime minister who was jailed, just called for all-out war in the saying he wants face-to-face battle, head-to-head, hand-to-hand. This isn't calling for peaceful protest. It reminds me more of Biden's infamous Philadelphia speech in which he accused half of America of being fascist if they didn't vote Democrat. So I'm trying to understand the Israeli public. So I do believe, we've touched on this, the Israeli leadership, it seems to me, is motivated a lot in part by politics. But what about the Israeli public, the 90,000 that are out on the street? Are they being brainwashed, or do they really believe this is the demise of the possible demise of Israel's future?
I define patriotism as loving your country because of its politicians sometimes, but despite its politics always. And Israelis remain deeply patriotic. The 64% who are calling for compromise are represented, and some of the rallies as well. Now, first of all, let's point out, if we're going to compare to the United States of America, and both we can talk about January 6th and the George Floyd riots, and there were riots, it wasn't just nonviolent protest. I have not heard of windows smashed during any one of those protests. I have not heard of rioting. I've been disgusted, as you have been, by some of the calls from the stage. I've been disgusted, as you have, by seeing a sign saying Iran is here. No, Iran is there. I've been disgusted by seeing the Palestinian flags. But that is a small minority. I want you to know, two stories that I heard from the protests are, one, the first night they sang a Hanukkah song. We've come to extinguish the dark and bring the forces of light. Now, you could say that I really prefer rhetorically not to speak of our fellow citizens as forces of light, as forces of darkness. But on the other hand, I love the fact that the language they were using was Hanukkah songs, Jewish language. I love the fact that when it started raining, I think the second protest, and they opened up umbrellas, they started singing Ma Tovu, how goodly are your tents. So even within the protests, there's a range of people. There's a very different vibe, for example, in the Tel Aviv protests and in the Jerusalem protests, which have many more religious people speaking and many more people. Like there was one very powerful speech, I wasn't there, but I heard about, where someone started by saying, the last time I protested I was protesting against the disengagement, meaning I am from the right, I'm religious, but I'm worried about where this government is going. So there's genuine cause of concern, and there is insanity. Unfortunately, the bottom up is showing more maturity, and the top down is showing too much insanity, again, from the far right and from the left. And I'm very proud of the fact that at the height of these protests, I went to visit my daughter on her intelligence base. And I walked in and it was clearly what we call the Republic of Tel Aviv. Most of the parents were dressed in a way that showed that they are Tel Avivis. They probably hate Bibi. They're upset about the reforms. Many of them were probably at the protests. But they are so proud of their kids for serving. They are so proud of being a part of this broader adventure called the State of Israel and protecting the State of Israel. And they also understand that when we got a briefing about things like Iran and Palestinian terrorism, there's no daylight between left and right when it comes to defending our country. We may have different ideas of how to achieve peace. We have different ideas about what strategies to use, but we all serve together. My son is in a battle unit and he is with left-wingers and right-wingers. My daughter's in an intelligence unit. It's mostly left-wingers, but there still is a smattering of religious kids. And that is Israel. And that's what I was calling the sinews of democracy, the song of the street, the habits of the heart that's missing all too often in America today. We don't have enough room in our country to have the big sword, the great untanglement. I go to weddings and I dance with religious and non-religious alike. In a given week, I speak to right-wing friends who think that Aryeh Deri is the greatest thing since sliced bread. And I go and I speak to left-wingers who are on their way to the demonstrations or coming back from the demonstrations. We're talking to one another. Sometimes we're shouting at one another, but that's the Jewish way, isn't it?
I hope the Jewish way doesn't ever involve safe spaces and intolerance for differing views. So,
I have to jump in on that. I was teaching a course last year to a group of quite left-wing Israelis, and the most left-wing in the room. She had multiple earrings and a couple of tattoos, and was born on a kibbutz and loved to assert her left-wingosity. Said, "We can't be politically correct," and she meant we Israelis. She said, "We Israelis can't be politically correct. We laugh too much. We have too much humor. We're too acerbic." And we're not seeing that in Israel. We're seeing, and by the way, I also, by the way, say to my gay friends, my Israeli Arab friends, my left-wing friends, my right-wing friends, I'm going to give you a time machine. You pick a date in Israeli history you want to go back to, where you had more rights, where there was more democracy, where there was more tolerance on the streets of Israel. And they can't go back to anywhere but 2023. We only have to go forward. So I'm not a pie in the sky idealist. I know we have challenges. I know there are substantive differences. But here's the key also. The latest political scientists analyzing the potential for succession in the United States of America, and I think they sometimes are dooming and glooming too, point out, if a society goes tribal, if the fights are tribal, we're in trouble. If the fights are ideological, it's doable. So if at the end of the day, the fight is over court reform, we'll figure out some compromise. There is no tribe for the court and tribe against the court. It is becoming tribal, where the Republic of Tel Aviv is saying, we have to have the court. And the Republic of the right and of Mizrahim is saying, the court is evil. And that's the danger. And I don't want us to jump into that. And I have to, if we're talking about the United States and America and Israel, we have to, I can't resist noting that my friends on the American left want a weaker Supreme Court at this moment, not 15 years ago. And otherwise, democracy is going to fall. And my friends on the Israeli left want a stronger court. Otherwise, democracy is going to fall. Maybe it's not about democracy falling or rising. Maybe it's about different power arrangements at different times. Let's all calm down. Let's all think about how we can work together. Let's all think about how to build, because that's always been the Zionist way.
Excellent points, Gil. There's a lot of questions in the queue, and I still have a number of my own. But before I turn to the queue, the audience questions, I do want to touch on threats to Israel's economy, because one of the more powerful fear-mongering assertions relates to the impact that the judicial reforms would have on Israel's economy, with claims that the reforms will make Israel's legal system less stable, thus impairing its credit rating and the strength of its high-tech sector, with investors being driven away. And in fact, JP Morgan began warning investors about Israel's domestic volatility, as they called it, in early February, and even went so far as to suggest that if the proposed reforms became a reality, the overall character of Israel's democratic systems could be affected, with the one potential downside being a risk to its sovereign credit rating. You've got hundreds of Israeli economists who signed an emergency letter on January 25th, warning that the proposed judicial reforms would lead to economic calamity. Few seem to notice that most of those economists actually supported political parties that opposed Bibi's 2000 free market reforms that led to a booming economy ever since. So, kind of once again, making that letter seem a little politically motivated. But you've got the Bank of Israel Governor Yaron warning Bibi in late January of likely negative economic impact of the reforms. You've got the high-tech sector that's influencing a lot of the protest movement. There's firms that are withdrawing funds and companies threatening strikes that involve medical professionals, IDF reservists, and on and on and on. So are these threats about Israel's economy political also, or are you concerned that there would be or there could be economic implications if these things don't temper down pretty quickly?
I'm lifting my hands. I'm trying to do the magic. I'm reaching into the Zoom and I'm trying to pull you over because I have a ticket that I'm actually missing right now to ShukTech, which is part of the Our Crowd conference I mentioned before. And right now, the Shuk in Jerusalem, the market, is being overrun by 6,500 high techies, many of them left wing, who are voting with their feet and voting, more important, with their pocketbooks and with their creativity in favor of Israel. And I would argue, let's do a little thought exercise. And again, I should emphasize, let's be honest, I sense that we probably disagree a little bit. I am more concerned about the speed and the brutality that the government has used in trying to push these reforms than others may be on the call. And I've called for them to slow down. And I'm very disturbed by some of the demagoguery coming from people who are in positions of authority in Israel right now. Nevertheless, let's do a little thought exercise. If this government had promulgated the same judicial reforms and they had passed, and there had been the usual yelling and screaming in the Knesset, but it hadn't gone to the streets, JP Morgan and the high techistas and all these people who have been objecting wouldn't be calling out wouldn't be predicting the demise of Israeli democracy. I think the fear about Israeli democracy itself collapsing has been somewhat of a phenomenon of the people who are fearing that Israeli democracy is collapsing. In other words, by constantly articulating that and by going straight to the anti-Trump playbook of these big long letters and these mass protests, they've created more of a crisis than there should have been. Now, again, I'm critical that the government didn't approach this in the most statesmanlike way. I really don't understand, and I've written a number of columns about this, what's in Bibi Netanyahu's head. The tension in the society has grown and grown. He's in charge. He's prime minister. And it's his job to lower the tension. And he hasn't been doing that. And maybe Micha Goodman's right, and he's playing some kind of long game because he also has to worry about his college. But right now, I call him out for the economic instability and the political instability because he's in charge. But all this talk, I don't understand why you can't, as I've done, make a critique of some of the reforms, make a critique of some of the pacing, make a critique of some of the demagoguery, call for a distinction between rules of the game, constitutive change, rights, which need to be sacrosanct, and particular policies. Why does that need to be done always in the language of the sky is falling and democracy is collapsing? That's the part that becomes so toxic. And that's the part that seems to be more political gamesmanship and a kind of brutal and dangerous game that makes me very disturbed. But again, what I was trying to say in my article, and what I'm hoping people walk away with, is that in general, the Tocquevillian analysis, the broader analysis is democracy is a multi-dimensional thing. It's a many-leveled things. You judge democracy by the songs of the street, by the habits of the heart, by the rights that people have. One person, I was in New Jersey recently, and somebody said, I read what's going on, and what sounds to me like what's happening in Israel is exactly the modesty police in Iran. And I lovingly, respectfully said, I sentence you to take a walk on the Tel Aviv beach, and then get back to me about the modesty police. The society is going and growing in many different directions, and the simplicity and the oversimplification, which leads to these doom and gloom cries, is very disturbing and just not accurate. Not the Israel I live every day.
Well, I think you bring up an important point that has me concerned, which is the influence of the diaspora on or the views of the diaspora and the influence that the hyperbolic rhetoric has on American Jews and their support for Israel. I think a lot of American Jews are not as tied in as some of us who live, eat, and breathe this stuff on a daily basis. And just here's some, you've got this, Maddie Friedman, Daniel Gordison, Yossi Klein Halavi wrote an article calling to, further the resistance of the new government, Marty Peretz and Leon Weasel Tier also wrote an article supporting the Israeli protesters. You've got Secretary Blinken, Senators Menendez and Durbin, Senator Jackie Rosen went to Israel, and she's a supporter of Israel, but she refused to meet with many of the cabinet members, claiming they were too far right. So you've got the head of the New York Jewish Federations who's spoken out against the reforms. So there's a lot in the diaspora that is influencing American Jewish opinion in a very negative way that has me concerned. I'm not
I agree with you. Look, as I've said, I've spoken out against elements of the reform, but there are ways of doing it which is constructive, and there are ways of doing it that's destructive. There are ways of doing it that leads to, and I think the important work that you do on Capitol Hill gets to this. All too often with Israel, more than any other country, we go from not liking what Israel does to rejecting what Israel is. That's what's going on with the Squad most dramatically. Right. And that distinction is what scares me in this rhetoric, because the rhetoric goes from what this government does to what Israel is. And it takes a lot. It takes a lot to really damage the soul of a country. These silly analogies between Israel and Poland and Hungary, and Turkey, when the democratic political culture of Israel is so deep, so embedded in Jewish culture. The culture of yelling and screaming and the rabbis in the Talmud and the Kehillah, the culture of the Bible, which talks about Tselem Elokim, how every one of us is made in a godly image, which is the core of democracy, that we all have inherent dignity and respect. So that's why I'm so disturbed by all this insane language. What I would most want from the diaspora, from our partners, is two things. One, to help keep on making this distinction between what Israel is and what Israel does. Two, to bring in ideas. I thought it was very helpful. You can love Alan Dershowitz or hate Alan Dershowitz, but Alan Dershowitz's front page article in the opinion section of the Jerusalem Post today was saying, based on his experience as a lawyer, says, yes, I have certain critiques of the reform, but here from the American constitutional perspective are ways of thinking this through, ways of helping. And the third thing I'm really asking each and every one of you to do is take a step back and take a deep breath and look at this moment in history. We are in what I'm calling the arc of Zionist triumph. We celebrated in August 125 years of Theodor Herzl's Zionist Congress. Think of where we were 126 years ago. We celebrated on November 29th, the 75th anniversary of the UN, I don't call it the UN partition plan, the UN recognition of the Jewish right to a state, and the Jewish right to establish a state on its homeland, and the Jewish right to assert ourselves as a people, not just a religion. And none of you, I'm sorry to say, took a day off. So I want to invite all of us, as we build to April 25th, 26th, Hey BER, or May 14th, if you choose to celebrate it then, figure out how you're going to celebrate Israel's 75th anniversary. And not just talk about the headaches of today, but talk about the achievements of yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And one of the things I'm trying to push is that we all make sure that our kids and our grandkids and our students have ice cream for breakfast on that day. Because let's taste the sweetness and let's see how special it is. And again, it comes from someone who has his critiques of, I'll say it, Ben Gvir, of some of the reforms, of the rhetoric that disrespects our army and our army discipline. I have serious concerns, but I try to do it in a way that's not destructive to the warp and woof of Israeli politics, to the warp and woof of Israeli diaspora relations, and disrespectful of the truth, which is much more complicated. We are far more resilient than anybody's giving us credit for. Israeli democracy is not at knife's edge unless people make that self-fulfilling prophecy come true.
Well, as you know, Emet means Hebrew, means truth in Hebrew. And we, as you mentioned, truth, that's why we hold these weekly webinars. And, I love what you said, because I think that Israel is actually a modern miracle. And very few American Jews that I'm in contact with actually recognize that and cherish her. When you watch the streets, you worry about her stability, but I love listening to you, Gil, because your optimism and grounding and what's actually going on and what it means in a historical perspective is very important. I'm going to turn to the Q&A because there are a lot of questions now. And someone asked, are you not setting up a straw man by talking about Israeli democracy being under attack? In fact, might it be fair to say that, in fact, Israeli electoral system suffers from too much democracy in the sense that it is an extreme version of proportional representation, leading to parliamentary instability and the necessity in certain circumstances to include convicted criminals in a government, extremists, et cetera, et cetera. Also, would it not be fair to say that really it's not democracy that's at stake, it's liberal democracy that's being attacked and is at stake, as that term is understood today?
So I've been joking for a couple of years now that Israelis love democracy so much that we went to the election not once, not twice, not three times, not four times, but now 5 times in 2.5, 3 years. And it's funny, right? It's very interesting, the question there, because for a long time, people have been saying, especially Americans used to look at Israel and say, oh my goodness, you have too much. You have too many parties and too much proportional representation and too many elections. Look how stable we are. Look how grown up we are. Now, obviously, as I said earlier, there's a broader crisis in Western democracy about rhetoric, about demagoguery, about leadership, about systems. And if we look at, and notice I don't compare Israel to its despicable dictatorial neighbors. I compare Israel to this exclusive club that it's a part of, the UK, the US, Australia, Canada, constructive liberal democracies. So I want Israel to be a robust liberal democracy. I understand that Israel, for historic reasons and also for current reasons, isn't going to be a two-party system. And in some ways, that's very good because it allows different voices to come in, at least for coalitions to be broader. On the other hand, it does lead to this constant stability where we see 1, 2, 3, 4 voices can hold an entire government hostage. No one's gotten it perfect. And I always say that democracy isn't perfect, and and decisions are often made that are imperfect, and leaders are often imperfect, but it is much better than the perfectly awful system of dictatorship. And it also is the best system we've created for bringing in the people's voice. And if we can take a step back and say, yes, look, this is a crisis that has been 75 years in the making because they didn't set up a constitution for very good reasons. And so there is a kind of blurring. In the United States of America, we have two things that are, even to this day with all the crises, are very strong. One is we have fragmented power. And I think one of the scary things about right now is, do you have too much concentrated power? Because you don't have a separation of powers like you have in the United States. You don't have even a president with a slightly different agenda, even if he's a Democrat, than Republicans and senators. You don't have power distributed among states. You can really have very highly concentrated power, which can be scary. So that's one of the dimensions. And the second dimension is that we don't have in Israel this nicely gradated difference. No demagogue could win power in the United States of America and overrule the First Amendment so easily. There are all kinds of checks and balances. So if we come out of this crisis with more checks and balances, with slower processes, again, I know I'm repeating myself, going to some of President Herzog's calls, we actually might have come to the precipice and ended up much stronger and more resilient. And on our 75th anniversary, we might be celebrating a breakthrough. Because, as I said earlier, in 1992, Aharon Barak basically improvised something out of a hat and out of his very clever brain. And that had its own problems of legitimacy. In 1949, David Ben-Gurion wanted it to be a super democracy so he could have the power. Maybe now, as we approach our 75th anniversary, as approach our golden years, we can find the balance that we need.
As you bring up the Constitution, I have actually a copy of the proposed Constitution that was drafted in 2006 that a cousin who was a judge at the time participated in drafting this. It was actually published on Tu B'Shvat, that it was February 13th, 2006. And I can't help but think that had Israel adopted a constitution, we wouldn't be where we are today. So back to the questions. Somebody said there seems to be little discussion about the number and therefore the influence of cases heard by the Israeli Supreme Court compared to any of the Canadian, British, and US systems, for example. Is there anything in the legislation that will address this concern, as clearly the Israeli court cannot give proper attention to each and every case they agree to hear?
Part of the critique of the court is that it's been quite exclusive, quite overwhelmingly Ashkenazi, quite overwhelmingly sort of clubby. Part of it is that it keeps on asserting its power in many, many ways. And I should point out, again, I mentioned this quickly, but I want to emphasize that there has been change. Thanks to Moshe Kachlon, who chaired a committee a few years ago, there's now more political input. And as a result, we saw more conservative judges being appointed in recent years. So it's not true that nothing has changed. It's not true that the current system doesn't allow for any kind of change. But secondly, I think the idea is they're not going to put limits formally on the number of cases heard. but they think that by limiting things like the reasonableness tool, by changing some of the questions of standing, you'll just have fewer cases bombarding the court, because the court is overwhelmed, and then the court gets to pick and choose its cases. And look, we've seen, we've been talking about some of the leaders. I've actually publicly criticized the president of the Supreme Court, Esther Hayut, because in a speech she gave about 3 weeks ago, she was so dismissive of the criticisms, so dismissive of any kind of protests, that she, in one speech, confirmed every right-winger's critique of the court and of the judicial system as being arrogant, as being dismissive, and as feeling it's above criticism. And what she needed to do at that moment was lean in. You can lean in without keeling over. Listen, acknowledge some of the pain, acknowledge some of the critiques, and say, let's talk. But she, like Yair Lapid, is saying, no, I'm not going to talk. First, I'm putting down preconditions. Unfortunately, when you lose an election, it's really hard to put down preconditions. And that's why I want the left and the right to listen to our president, to bring in the president of the Supreme Court, and for us to start talking together publicly. But also, most important, I want them to be talking privately, constructively, away from the microphones, away from the tweets, and try to figure out a solution. It's doable. It's achievable. It's not tribal yet.
People are asking some specific questions about the court itself. What's the makeup of the committee that selects the courts, judges, how many people, and from what areas, legal Knesset, et cetera. I know there have been a lot of articles on that, but do you want to maybe just touch on?
So again, the most important thing to emphasize is that once upon a time, it was the court and the members of the Bar Association. So it was very, very self-reflective. And Kahlon's reform brought in members of the coalition. And not only that, but now we saw in the recent round of appointees, there was a bit of a stalemate. And lo and behold, both sides won. The court and the Bar Association types got a number of justices in, and the Likudnikim got a number of justices in. That's politics. That's democratic politics. And the thing that's so scary to me, and you see I'm an optimist, but there are certain things that scare me. The things that's so scary to me about the rhetoric that's going on in the United States and in Israel is it's all or nothing. And the way you govern constructively, and again, this is a critique not just of the left, but the right too, is you find that middle path. And when the government uses the most extreme voices to ignore the 64%, to ignore me and others far more important than me, who are calling for some kind of process, and say, well, look, they're not willing to sit at the table, that's playing with a straw man. And when the left uses this rhetoric of there's no democracy and democracy is going to collapse, that's just creating more toxicity. So we need to reduce the air pollution, not put in more poison, and try to figure out a solution. But again, there are many technical dimensions. Like that question is a technical dimension. So if it's 9 or 6, is it 12 or 8? That's doable through compromise. That's not all or nothing. That's not Hobbesian. It's Lockean. It's not this fight of forces of good versus forces of evil leading to anarchy. It's a back and forth between politicians who are trying to figure out the best way.
I'm going to take one more question before we have to go. And I like this question because it's something that you've come back to a number of times, which is moderation. And somebody asked, some of the most extreme rhetoric has come from people that this particular person has always admired as moderates, whether it's Gordis, Matty Friedman, Erwin Kotler. Why has this happened? What's happened to the moderate voices that have ventured off into the extreme?
Well, first of all, I'd like to speak for Yedidya Stern, who's the head of the Jewish People's Policy Institute, which is now running a massive campaign. You can sign it from the Diaspora and in Israel, in English and in Hebrew, for moderation. I want to echo my admiration. You've heard it for President Herzog, Natan Sharansky. Many people have been calling for a voice in the center. I know that I read what Erwin wrote, and Erwin Kotler, whom I greatly admire. And while he had one sentence that I wouldn't have used, and I say this to him if you were in the room about it but it was very carefully worded. It said, if all these reforms were to go in, Israel would then be a denigrated or weakened democracy. That was the most inflammatory thing he said. But most of what Erwin said in that article was extremely constructive, extremely on point. And he actually made a really interesting example, which I think is a good way of ending, which is that when Pierre Trudeau, the elder, came in with constitutional reforms, he was pushing. and everybody talked about Trudeau's reforms. And over the course of a 2-year process, they had hearing after hearing after hearing. I think Irwin himself testified 4 different times. And by the end of the process, they were calling it the People's Constitution, not the Trudeau Constitution. Talking is a very constructive device in a democracy. As Winston Churchill said, we need more jaw and less war. We need to have and that's where I'm hoping that out of this crisis, out of all this tension, out of all this fear, can come some kind of new approach, both to, in general, leadership. Let Israel be a model where Bibi Netanyahu and Yair Lapid stop demagoguing and stop demonizing the others for daring to oppose, but start remembering that when you're elected prime minister, you're the prime minister of all the people. So one is, I just want a tonal shift. But secondly, I think if we could start seeing some changes in the fundamental rules of the game, a distinction, as I keep on saying, between rights, which must be sacrosanct and eternal and above the political fray, rules of the game, which can be changed, but only carefully through a deliberative process, and policies. Using that 3-point analysis, maybe out of this moment of tension, we'll remember, first of all, to celebrate all that Israel is. We'll remember all the great things that we've achieved. And 2 months from now, 3 months from now, 4 months from now, we'll look at this moment as a moment of panic and of storm before the calm. But it'll only happen with all of us, working together, thinking together, dreaming together, and calming the roiled waters together. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Gil. Your presentation was, as I expected, informative, optimistic, and I really appreciate it. And I hope everybody's going to walk away from our webinar feeling that Israel's democracy is fine. Thank you all for joining. I hope that you follow Gil's work. He writes weekly in the Jerusalem Post, and I hope you continue to support Emmett. We look forward to seeing you next week, and have a great afternoon. Thanks to everyone. Thank you, Gil.
Thank you for your kind words. Bye.